a little girl who has never left home, a mother who keeps the world hidden behind thick curtains, and a man, carrying the smell of the sea breeze and untold stories, enters their lives. No one would have thought a small wooden boat, a yellow butterfly, or a stone picked up from the beach could change a childhood. This is not a story about miracles. It is a story about a door finally opened. The small grey house sat at the end of a dirt road, just on the edge of a coastal town. From the outside, it looked like any other: a low wooden fence, a front porch, and a seashell wind chime that jingled softly when the sea breeze blew. But inside the house, a little girl named Anna had lived her entire 12 years without ever stepping foot outside. Anna's room was in the corner of the house, where light filtered in through a small window covered by a thick curtain. The curtain was rarely pulled aside. It acted as a shield, both to block out the sunlight and to hide her existence from the outside world. Anna had light brown hair, a chubby face that was pale from lack of sunlight. Her legs were thin and weak, a birth defect that prevented her muscles from developing normally. Therefore, Anna could not walk like other children. The little girl could only shuffle slowly across the room, or sit quietly for hours on a chair by the window, listening to the sound of the waves crashing against the cliffs in the distance. Every day in that room was coldly similar. In the early morning, her mother would leave breakfast on the small table next to the bed, then rush off to work at the tailor shop in town. Anna ate in silence, studying the old books her mother had left behind. And if she was in the mood, she would sit and draw on paper birds she had only seen illustrated in books. Sometimes there were the sounds of children playing on the small road, the cries of fish from a fisherman's truck, or the distant ringing of church bells. But those sounds never entered Anna's world. To her, everything existed only as echoes from a world she was not allowed to touch. She had never known the feeling of sand under her feet, never smelled real salt, never even known what it was like to run, to fall, and laugh. For her, freedom was an abstraction, like the seagulls circling the blue sky that she could only look up at from behind the glass. And then, every night, her mother would come home, exhausted, worried, and silent. They didn't talk much. The love between them was still there, but it was overlaid with the layers of fear, guilt, and helplessness. There was only one thing Anna knew for sure: the world out there wasn't for her. Anna's mother's name is Marlene. She is in her 30s, with sad eyes and calloused hands from sewing too much. She once dreamed of becoming an art teacher, loved the sea, and often sat drawing when she was young. But everything stopped when Anna was born, along with emergency visits, cold medical conclusions, and pitying eyes from those around her. The day Anna could not walk was also the day Marlene withdrew. From a cheerful girl, she became a mother who was always worried. It was not because she did not love her child. On the contrary, she loved her so much that she was willing to confine her and her child to that small house for the rest of their lives, just to avoid what she considered the hurt from the eyes of the world. Every time she went to the market, if someone asked, "How is the baby?" she would just answer vaguely and change the subject. Every time she saw children the same age as Anna running around, she would turn away. Inside the house, she had closed the curtains, afraid that the neighbors would see her child sitting on the floor, her legs unable to stand. For Marlene, the world outside was a sandy beach where the waves could sweep away anything fragile, and Anna was the shell that she had to hide carefully, so that the waves could not carry her away. In her mind, she was protecting her child, But in that protection, she gradually stopped hearing Anna, couldn't hear what she needed, what she wanted, couldn't see the sadness in those two quiet eyes. Once, when cleaning out an old bookcase, Marlene came across Anna's first drawing, a paper boat floating in the middle of the ocean. On the sail, instead of the shape of the wind, were small, pale blue legs. The drawing was very simple, but it made her speechless. Could it be that she herself was the wind, but the opposite wind, holding her child back instead of pushing him out to sea? But then she folded the drawing and put it in a drawer, because she wasn't ready, because the fear was still greater than anything. And Anna sat by the window, holding the old seashell her mother had picked up on the beach years ago, listening to the sound inside it, vaguely like the ocean, or perhaps an echo from a world she had never touched. The little seaside town had not changed much over the years. The cobblestone streets were still as rough as ever. The grocery store still hung its old wind chimes. The sea still lapped against the rocks with a steady, unfailing routine. But then one day, a man appeared. His name was George, hair as white as frost, skin tanned, slightly hunched, but eyes as bright as the waves reflecting the sun. He did not talk much, and nothing glittered except the worn silver ring on his left hand. He had been a sailor, more than 30 years of drifting between strange ports, now retired and living on his meager savings and memories of the past that he had never fully shared with anyone. George met Marlene one rainy afternoon as she tried to prop up her fallen motorbike near the market. He said nothing, just walked over to prop up the motorbike, took out a handkerchief to quickly wipe the dirt off her canvas bag, and walked away. But that action, silent, without a response, had been imprinted on Marlene's heart like a deft stitch to a tear. Then came a few encounters, an invitation to coffee, an afternoon sitting on the porch telling stories of the sea. George didn't ask much about Anna. He just listened as Marlene shared. When she said, "I kept her in the house because I knew she would get hurt out there," he didn't judge. He just nodded and said, "I've been battered by the sea a few times, but I still chose to go out." That spring, they had a simple wedding in the backyard, under a canopy of purple flowers. There were no guests, except a few close neighbors. Anna watched the ceremony through the window of her bedroom, where she sat every day, as if it were part of some dream that wasn't meant for her. George moved into the house, taking with him only a few belongings, an old wooden trunk, a few black and white photographs, and a leather-bound travel journal. The book was placed on the bookshelf by Anna's window, right below the tiny picture of the boat she had drawn. At first, Anna didn't look at him, didn't say anything except nods. But George wasn't in a hurry. He didn't impose, didn't try to be a father. He just did the little things. He replaced the hinges on the door that were stuck. He put a softer pillow on her chair, and every morning he left on the table a strange seashell he'd found in the backyard. Anna began to notice his presence the way one notices the smell of the sea on the wind, fleeting, gentle, and persistent. Summer evenings in the seaside town were always gentle. The breeze was cool. The insects were chirping. And in the distance, the sound of waves. In the little house, Marlene sat in the kitchen reading, and Anna sat by the window as usual. George entered her room without knocking, without asking, because it was an unspoken agreement. If she didn't want to, she could turn her back. But that day, she didn't turn her back. George put the leather-bound book on the small table next to the chair. He didn't sit close, but chose the chair opposite, tilting his head slightly toward her. "Have you ever heard of a lighthouse?" Anna. She shook her head. George began to tell. His voice was low, not loud, but had a pleasant rhythm like the sound of waves. He told of the first time he saw the lighthouse at night, a lone light in the Black Sea, like the eyes of someone still waiting on the far shore. I was 19 years old, seasick, and I threw up all day. But when I saw that light, I knew I wasn't lost. Anna said nothing, but her eyes never left the book. George slowly opened it. Inside were old pages, covered with black ink maps of the sea, ships of all shapes, even winged fish and glowing jellyfish. I drew during sleepless nights, when the sea was windy. Once, I drew a whale for 10 hours, because it swam after the ship as if to keep me company. Anna chuckled. It was just a small sound, but for George, it was the first symphony. From that day on, every evening, George came, telling Anna about a journey. Sometimes it was an iceberg island, sometimes a fishing village in Africa, or sometimes just the story of an old seagull. Anna began to wait for him. She sat there, hugging her knees, her eyes lighting up every time he entered. She didn't talk much, but every time he finished, she drew. The drawings were simple, but they had the breath of the sea. George didn't ask why she had drawn a ship with wheels, or why the sun was always on the left edge of the picture. He just said gently, "If you want, someday we can really go see the ocean." Anna was silent, but this time she didn't shake her head. It was a gloomy afternoon, the clouds hanging like a heavy blanket over the town. George did not come to Anna's room as usual. He had disappeared all morning, leaving only a handwritten note on the dining table. Small surprise today. Marlene did not ask. She knew George never did anything rash. However, she kept glancing at the clock all afternoon, her heart quietly restless. As the clock struck 5, the back door opened. George entered, holding a rectangular wooden box, not even an arm's length long. On the lid was a piece of cloth carefully tied, embroidered with the words, "For Anna," in white thread. He knocked on her door, the first time he had done so. "Are you busy?" His voice was soft, but clear. Anna was silent for a few seconds, then answered softly, "No." George entered, placing the box on the table, facing her. She looked at it, half curious, half wary. "I made it myself. It took 3 days and a little skin." He laughed, pointing to the small scratch on his thumb. Anna opened the box. Inside was a small wooden boat, detailed to the last detail, from the masts and ropes to the rudder at the stern. The hull was varnished to a high shine, and a small silver star was attached to the bow, like the spirit of the voyage. "I can't draw as well as you, but I'm good at making things that can travel," George said. Leaning on the arm of the chair, Anna reached out to touch the boat, her fingertips trembling. She had never received a handmade gift before. Everything she owned, clothes, books, toys, was something her mother had taken home from people who had taken pity on her. But this boat was different. "Can you paint it?" she asked hesitantly, her eyes looking up for the first time to meet George's. He squinted, as if to keep his joy from bursting into a big smile. "Of course. I saved the paint on the porch. There's blue, too." A few minutes later, George had laid out his palette, brushes, and washcloth on the table by the window. Anna, in her loose sweater, was quietly bending over to mix the colors. She chose pale blue for the hull, white for the sails, and a tiny red dot on the bow, a distant greeting. When she was finished, George placed the boat on the bookshelf, right next to his journal. "Do you think it could really go to sea?" she asked, her voice a strangled sigh. George didn't answer right away. He just looked out the window, where the waves in the distance were still crashing against the rocks, distant but distinct. "Maybe," he said, "if one day the boat finds a brave oarsman." Anna did not smile, but for the first time in years, she did not bend over in fear, but sat up straight and looked ahead. And that evening, after Anna had fallen asleep, George sat in the living room with Marlene. The light was soft yellow, reflecting off the warm cup of tea on the wooden table. Outside the window, the fog had begun to roll in. Marlene sat still, her hands clasped together. George looked toward Anna's room. The dim light coming from under the door seemed to indicate that someone inside was still awake, thinking. "I know what you're thinking." Marlene spoke, her voice not angry, just a little wary. George did not respond immediately. He took a slow sip of tea, then put the cup down. His voice was low but steady, I think. "It's time for you to go out." Marlene raised her head, a flicker of something in her eyes, worry or anger. He couldn't tell. "You've never seen her like that. All my life I've heard pity and questions that pretend to be concerned. I don't want Anna to suffer anymore. I understand. But don't you think that's why she needs to go out?" "No." Marlene's voice was sharp. "She's weak. What if she falls? What if someone laughs at her? And if she can't walk, what's left?" George asked, softly but unyieldingly. The room fell silent. The clock ticked away. Marlene turned away, her eyes beginning to water. Part of her knew George was right, but her fear the old rusty anchor in her heart had held her back for too long. George said nothing more. He stood up, adjusted the scarf around her shoulders, and went back to his room. But before he left the living room, he said one sentence, not loudly, but enough to echo through the night. "There are waves that, if you look at them once, are enough to change your whole life." Marlene sat there, alone, in the old yellow light. She looked out the window, where there was no sea, no waves, only darkness and unanswered questions. That morning, the town sky was as clear as glass wiped clean after a night of rain. The gentle sunlight shone through Anna's window, reflecting off her light brown hair that fell lightly over her shoulders as she sat leaning against the wall. George entered as usual, wearing a thin woolen scarf and a small cream-coloured hat. He said nothing, just put everything on a chair and looked at her. "Do you want to go out for a while?" Anna looked up. 1 second, 2 seconds. Then her eyes returned to the window. "I'm not sure." George walked closer and sat down. "I'll carry you. No one will see. It's just the porch. We won't go far." Anna hesitated. She was filled with two conflicting emotions, longing, like a faint breeze that had just come through the crack in the door, and fear, like a rope that had been tied for 12 years. But then she nodded, so light that if she hadn't looked closely, George might have missed it. He smiled, not asking any more questions. After a while, he picked her up, as light as a shell that had been lying on the sand for a long time. She didn't look at him, just squeezed his shoulder with her two small hands. The door opened. The wind rushed in. The smell of the sea, really, rushed into Anna's chest, salty and pure, so much so that she held her breath to keep the scent longer. George put her down on the porch chair, where a thin cushion had been prepared. She sat there, confused. The sunlight fell on her face, her eyes narrowed. It had been a long time since she had seen such strong light. "What do you see?" George asked. Anna hesitated. "It's warm." The wind blew softly. The shell wind chimes tinkled. A cat walked across the steps from somewhere, silently, as if it knew that this was a sacred moment that should not be disturbed. Anna looked out into the garden. The green of the grass, the wild lavender, the sky, it all flooded her eyes for the first time. She had never thought things could be so colourful. She reached out and touched a gently shaking leaf. For the first time in her life, she felt unblocked. George said nothing more. He sat beside her, silent as a sentinel for a newly opened door. There was a deep joy in his eyes, not loud, not ostentatious, but proud, like someone who had just witnessed a miracle. From where she sat, Anna could see almost the entire front yard, what had previously been a distorted image through the bedroom glass. And then something unexpected happened. A small yellow butterfly flew by, stopping on the tip of her finger, which she held up to touch the wind. Anna paused. Her eyes widened. Her lips moved slightly. She did not dare move, afraid that even a strong breath would send it flying away. George saw, but did not interfere. He understood one butterfly was enough to change a whole depth of perception. As the butterfly flapped its wings and flew away, Anna continued to watch. A strange feeling rose within her, indescribable, but almost like regret. "Can I chase it?" the girl asked. As small as a breath, George turned, his eyes shining. "You don't need to chase. Just stay by its side." The answer left Anna stunned. She didn't understand it all, but something in her heart stirred. George stood up, went into the house, and returned with something special, a small wooden cart he had been quietly building for the past few weeks. It had rubber wheels, a soft back, and a sturdy handle. Everything was made of wood, rustic but refined. "I made this so we can go for a walk without waiting for your legs to get better." Anna looked at the cart. It wasn't a hospital chair. It wasn't a wooden crutch. It was like a sleigh in a fairy tale, but for the ground and for people who couldn't run. George placed the cart in front of her, spread a blanket inside, and gently lifted her in. "Where are we going?" she asked, excitement in her voice for the first time. George smiled. "To see the world." The cart began to roll. The wheels glided across the lawn, down the red dirt path that led out of the alley. Anna sat with her head tilted, her eyes constantly moving, from the flower by the fence, to the little bug crawling under the rock, to the withered leaf blowing in the wind. She had never known such simple things could be so beautiful. Occasionally, she turned to look at George, as if to make sure he was still there, and every time, he pushed the cart with both hands steady, his eyes looking ahead, without a map, like every sailor who trusts in his own inner compass. Anna raised her head. Above, a flock of birds flew by, chirping loudly in the blue sky. She whispered softly, as if talking to herself, or maybe to George, "I don't want to go back inside." George didn't answer. He just leaned down, gently pulled her hat down to shield her from the sun, and continued pushing the cart around the bend that led to the dirt road near the sea. In the distance, the smell of salt began to permeate the air. The wooden cart rolled gently along the dirt road leading to the beach, a winding path that wound through rows of casuarinas and sand dunes. George pushed the cart steadily, not fast, not slow, as if each step carried the quiet solemnity of someone bearing witness to something greater than himself. Anna sat quietly in the cart. The wind blew against her face, slightly cold, carrying a distinctive salty smell that she had read about somewhere in books, but had never actually felt. The smell was not only in her nose, it seeped into her hair, into her skin, into her heart, which was pounding, whether from excitement or excitement. She was not sure. All around, the scenery changed gradually. The wooden fences of the town disappeared, giving way to dense undergrowth. In the distance were sand dunes, white, spongy, and undulating like the undertow of the mainland. The gentle grinding of the cart against the sand made a strange sound, as if the wheels were bursting with Anna's joy. "Are you cold?" George asked, still holding her hand. Anna shook her head slightly. She didn't want to speak, didn't want to interrupt the wonderful silence. She felt as if she were floating, not in the car, but in the very current of a dream she had never dared to dream before. A bird flew low overhead. Anna looked up, her eyes following each expansion of its wings. "Where is it going?" she asked softly. George followed the direction. "Do you see the horizon?" Anna squinted. The far side, a thick blue streak across the sky, was vague but distinct. "It's where the sea and the sky meet." He continued, "There are no boundaries. No one asks where you come from. No one tells you to be like anyone else." Anna was silent. Her eyes sparkled, like water caught in the sun. "I think I want to go there someday." George smiled slightly. "I'm on my way." They continued on. The wheels turned the last corner. Little did she know that with just one more row of casuarinas, the whole world would change, And then, just a small turn, everything appeared before them. The ocean opened up like a gate without a lock. The sea stretched to the horizon, where the blue sky melted into the rippling water. Waves lapped steadily on the sand, rhythmically like an ancient song that never stopped. Anna paused. Her eyes widened, her mouth slightly open as if she couldn't believe what was before her was real. George stopped the car. "We're here," he said. But the words seemed unnecessary, because all of Anna's senses were screaming this was the place. She raised her hand to block the sun, then let it fall, wanting to see everything. White waves lapped against the shore as if they were playing. The wind carried the salty smell of freedom. Seabirds swooped by, calling out, and Anna didn't know whether to laugh or cry. She looked at George, as if to make sure this wasn't a dream. "George," she whispered, "I saw the ocean." George leaned down, sat next to the car, and put his hand on her shoulder. "It's true," Anna said louder. Her voice choked, and then she screamed over the wind, "I saw the ocean." "It's true. I saw the ocean," a cry from a heart that had been imprisoned for 12 years, a confirmation that needed no approval, no signature, no medical certificate, just joy, just light. George put his arms around her. Anna also wrapped her arms around him, the first time she had taken the initiative to hug someone, not because she had fallen, not because she was afraid, but because she wanted to keep this moment, to hold it tightly to her heart, like holding a precious, irreplaceable gift. The afternoon sunlight spread gold across the sand, covering Anna's radiant face. In those eyes, no longer the weak child living in the darkness, but someone who had just seen the ocean and knew that this world still had a place for her. George said nothing. He just placed his calloused hand on her hair, stroking it gently like the waves touching the shore, gentle, patient, and full of love. In the distance, fishing boats were turning back through the waves, and somewhere in the light, a tiny wooden boat like in a painting was floating on the sea in the imagination of a little girl who had just known freedom for the first time. Anna was still in the car, but her mind was flying beyond her sight. She could no longer hear the waves, could no longer feel the wheels under her back. Everything seemed to dissolve into the feeling of being alive for the first time. 12 years of pent-up emotions poured out with tears, but it was not sadness. It was release. The wind picked up. A piece of her scarf flew off her head. George reached out to catch it, carefully tying it for her like a father tying the shoelaces of a child about to walk. "You know," he whispered, "when I was a sailor, I was afraid of the sea." Anna turned to look at him, surprised. How could someone who had lived his whole life in the ocean be afraid of the sea? George chuckled. "I was lost. The ship lost contact. I was drifting in the middle of the night with no moon, no lights. I thought I was going to die." "So, how do you live?" the girl asked, her eyes watery but strangely clear. George did not answer right away. He looked out at the sea, his eyes dark as if he were reliving the moment. "I did nothing. The sea let me live. And from that moment on, I understood the sea is not a place to conquer. It is a place to listen." Anna was silent, then whispered, "Want to hear more? Every day." George nodded. He knew she was talking about more than the stories he told her, about life, about the wind, about the waves, about everything that had been taken from her throughout her childhood. She bent down to pick up a small stone that had washed up on the sand. Silvery grey and smooth, she held it in her palm like a treasure. "I will take this stone home," she said, "to remember this day." George looked at her, his eyes shining but not shedding tears. There had been too many days when he had seen people ignore moments like this. But today, between him and the little girl, was a story that did not need to be told in words, just lived in the heart. On the way back, Anna still held the stone in her hand. She did not take her eyes off the sea, as if afraid that if she looked away, everything would disappear like a dream. "George," she called as the car passed the old stone beach, where the sound of the waves echoed between the rocks like a distant piano. "Yes," he replied. "Thank you, Uncle, for not being afraid to help a kid like me." George paused for a moment. Then he turned back, bending down to the little girl's level. "No one is a kid like you. You are Anna, a person who has just touched the light of the ocean, and that is something I have never seen anyone do so well." Anna laughed. She really laughed, without hesitation, without fear, and in that laugh, the world finally opened up to her. That afternoon, when George dropped Anna off, Marlene was standing in the kitchen, cooking dinner. She had her back to the window, as she always did, and didn't notice that it was open wider than usual. Then she heard something, not loud, not clear, but it made her heart clench. It was laughter, not anyone else's, Anna's laughter. She put down her spoon and hurried out onto the porch, before her eyes. George was pushing the wooden cart across the yard, and Anna was sitting in it, her hair tousled in the wind, her cheeks rosy from the sun. a small stone in her hand. Marlene stood still, her eyes widened, not in shock, but in disbelief. Her daughter was laughing, not at a joke, not in imitation, but a real smile from the bottom of her heart. George stopped the cart. "Hello," he said softly. "We're just going for a walk." Anna looked at her mother, not avoiding her as usual. Instead, she raised her hand, holding the stone out in front of her. "Mommy, I've seen the ocean." Her voice was not trembling, not afraid, but full of pride, like a child learning to walk, to talk, to live for the first time. Marlene stepped forward, bent down, and took the small hand that was outstretched. She picked up the stone, looked closely, and then gently placed her hand on Anna's cheek. "Are you cold now, Mum?" Anna shook her head. "The ocean is warm." Marlene couldn't hold back her tears. For years she had kept her daughter in the house, thinking she was protecting her. But perhaps, in that love was also a selfish fear. And today, a man who had been lost at sea was the one who led her daughter into the light. That night, in the familiar room, Anna sat on the bed, by the window. But this time, the curtains weren't drawn. The sea breeze blew in, carrying the salt air, the sound of waves, and the hazy moonlight. Marlene walked in, put the glass of milk on the table, and sat down next to her daughter. "Do you want to tell me about the ocean?" she asked. Anna nodded. "I saw the horizon, and the birds, and the waves. You know, the ocean is not afraid of me." Marlene hugged her daughter tightly. "I'm sorry. I was afraid for you for so long." No one said anything more, but in the eyes of mother and daughter, the wall that had separated them for 12 years had disappeared. Out there, the ocean was still caressing, but in the small room, another ocean had just been born, from a little girl who had never dared to look out the window. Now she could smile, dream, and say the 3 simplest yet most powerful words, "I am alive."